Let's kind of lean into our verse for the retreat. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good work. And let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. You know, this is written in challenging times. This is written for difficult times. I'm almost 60. It's strange to think about. Every now and then I'll walk by a mirror and I'll think who's the old dude? And you don't see yourself that way. And yet it is what is in front of you. I think a lot of the challenge in your late 50s is just managing loss. I do. It's just managing loss. You can't do what you used to do the way you used to do it. You don't have some of what you used to have, like hair. It's just this managing. And I think when we suffer loss, and certainly we have all suffered loss in the past 2 or 3 years, I think there's always this idea that we want to go back. But what I need to tell you is you can never go back because it isn't there anymore. It isn't there anymore. And so, like it or not, we only really have one choice, and that's to press on. And part of what I learned from No Greater Love is you press on when you want to, and you press on when you don't want to, and you press on when you feel it, and you press on when you don't feel it. You press on because for whatever reason, God has left us in this world. And if he's left us here, he must still have something for us to do. And he must have something for us to accomplish. And so we press on. You know, one of the things I've always thought about is where do we fit? You know, one of the great things about No Greater Love is it's a place where people fit. Not everybody fits in No Greater Love, which is part of what's really cool about it. I remember I saw a 30 for 30 on ESPN. It was on Bill Parcells, the football coach, and he said the NFL has never drawn particularly well-adjusted men. And I thought to myself, you know, NGL kind of draws this group of guys who all have something in common. We all feel called to something, even if we can't always put our finger on it, that's more than what we had. Why did you go to that first Mardi Gras trip? If everything was going great, you wouldn't need to do that. But there was something inside of all of us that had a sense of destiny, a sense of purpose. We needed a place to fit. Was there ever a time in your life when you just felt like you were in the God zone? When you truly felt God's pleasure, everything worked? For a lot of us, some of that has come through No Greater Love. Some of the true tastes of significance we have ever had happened through the ministry of No Greater Love and through all of its offspring. I mean, No Greater Love, if nothing else, is a paterfamilias. It has spawned and spawned and spawned ministries all over the world. Can trace themselves back to No Greater Love. No Greater Love is a community. It's a brotherhood. It's a place where, though we come from different parts of the country and we have different experiences and different lives, somehow No Greater Love gives us something in common, a place to fit. For many, No Greater Love is maybe the time in your life when you most feel like a warrior of the Lord, when you most feel like a free man. King David was about to die, all warriors do. To his surprise, he would not die in battle. He would die an old man in a time of peace. It was really a bad piece of luck. He had slain a giant as a boy. He had eluded Saul in the southern deserts. If you read David and Saul going back and forth, it's like you died and went to a Townes Van Zandt song. It's sort of like Pancho and Lefty, just kind of chasing each other through the deserts in Mexico. And David kind of winds up in Cleveland, and it's cold. David had slain a giant as a boy, eluded Saul, fought the Philistines, commanded a mercenary army, become a monarch, expanded his territory, withstood assaults from kings and betrayals from sons, but now he was old. It was all almost over. When he looked in the mirror, he saw an old man. He had won, his enemies had lost, but now he was old and cold. The prophet Samuel records the final psalm written by David in 2 Samuel 23, of all places. The psalm ends with the godless consumed in fire. It's how all great movies end. Every great movie I like ends up with the godless being consumed in fire. The hero walks away from an inferno, because warriors are warriors, and there's always something burning inside of them and behind them. There are really two significant things David leaves behind. He leaves a spiritual legacy, but we don't really think about this. But one of the two great things David left behind were his men. His men. I talked about football a minute ago. We all know how difficult it is to reach the NFL, much less to be a great player. Tens of thousands of guys have played in the NFL, got a cup of coffee and a quick injury, and we're gone, and nobody really remembers now but themselves and their buddies and their families. But, some players become immortalized. Some players are so burned in our consciousness that I could just say their name and it puts you at a time and a place. They have transportive powers. They'll take you somewhere. How's this? Jim Brown. That'll take you somewhere. Cleveland with Lefty. Roger Staubach. Brett Favre, a man who played football. He didn't work it. How about Walter Payton? Kurt Warner. They're going to make a movie about Kurt Warner. Hope it's not terrible. I think you get the idea. David's mightiest men are divided into the 30 and the 3. These were the men who made Israel great. Everybody knew who David was, but it was these men who made Israel great. It was they who lived and loved and fought and bled and died with David. They lived really hard lives. Have you guys ever been in the Judean deserts? I mean, with the exception of En-Gedi, which is somehow a waterfall in the middle of a desert, there is nothing around. It is the most inhospitable place on earth. It is nearly lunar. That's where David lived. His men lived hard lives. But they were free men. And though they may have been individually forgotten, their collective lives comprise David's legend and his legacy. And one of the things you get a feel for when you read 1 Samuel is that David loved his men. And his men loved David. The 30 were all in the Hall of Fame, but 3 were the GOATs, the greatest of all time. It's a great story. One of the things I love about No Greater Love is telling stories. And every one of you I know well, a story comes to mind. I look at Jim Murphy. There were 2 rival groups headed straight toward each other. Downtown Carbondale, 19, who cares? And there was going to be a fight. It was inevitable. And I was just feeling the emotion. You guys remember the Carbondale Halloween thing? I mean, it was just nuts. And I remember Jim just jumping in between the two leaders of those groups and saying, there's not going to be a fight here today, boys. And there wasn't a fight there today. I just have memories of so many of you. And those memories are of warriors of the Lord. And maybe you don't always feel like a warrior, and warriors aren't always in battle. But no greater love was always the time that we were in battle, that we were in warrior mode. And for a lot of people, it was the time they felt most alive and most free and most who God created them to be. Well, the warriors were all talking, David and the three, and they were in a cave, in Adullam, and they were just swapping stories, just swapping stories. And David gets talking about his favorite well when he was a boy. We don't think about a favorite well. But he's thinking about his favorite well. It was near Bethlehem where he was a boy, and he's talking about how sweet the water was. Well, it's time for bed. David and the boys were fighting the Philistines. Philistines are a coastal people, kind of showed up really a little late, probably Phoenicians. They set up on the coast, and they controlled the coast. Israel is inland in the hills, and the Philistines were doing really, really well, and they wanted the trade routes. And so they're pushing on Israel, and David's pushing back. But at this moment, Bethlehem is behind enemy lines. The Philistines control Bethlehem. And David's soldiers sneaked through the enemy lines, located this well, and got water for David, then sneaked back through enemy lines, got back to Adullam, and said, David, look what we have. Water from that well. David is so overwhelmed that he pours the water out as an offering to the Lord because it's sacred, it's holy, it's set apart. The potential price for that water was far too great to drink it. David's a severely flawed man. And yet, he's a severely flawed man who had an exceptional capacity for God. I never really understood that when I was a boy. I would always look at these incredibly flawed Old Testament characters and wonder how God could use them. It always seemed to me they should have been better than they were. But what David had was a capacity for God. A capacity so significant that he's denoted as a man after God's own heart, even in the New Testament when people figured out how to behave. David was flawed, but he was the greatest king in the history of Israel, hands down. And just as his character flaws opened him up for nonstop drama, we all know the effect of sin, right? Sin creates drama. The more sin you have in your life, the more drama you have. God forgives sin, but you still got the drama. The more sin has been in your life, the more drama you're going to have. It's just about sowing and reaping. David had drama. He had Kardashian kind of drama. He's betrayed. He's attacked. But his virtues produced a group of men. And through these men, God kept salvation history online. So I want to look at the three and ask ourselves what it might mean to become mighty men of God now, not before the pandemic, not before America divided into sides and came out punching. What does it mean to be mighty men of God now? What can we learn? I'm in 2 Samuel 23, 8 through 12. I'm just going to walk through. Verse 8, these are the names of David's three mightiest men. You ever wonder what it would take for us not just to be Christians, not just to be good men, good husbands, effective fathers, productive in the workplace, but you ever wonder what it might take to be a mighty man, the best of men in the ways that matter to God. Most people today live their lives blindly running a cultural template, not even considering that they may possess the stuff of greatness. Might you possess the stuff of greatness? And since we have no idea how to be great, we settle. We settle. I have so many young men tell me they feel like a tiger in a cage. And they settle. We settle for the life of the standardized and the interchangeable. We drive our standardized and interchangeable cars into standardized and interchangeable sports facilities where we drop off our standardized and interchangeable children to play standardized and interchangeable sports, and we call it a life. We eat in standardized and interchangeable restaurants. We cook out on standardized and interchangeable grills. We swim in standardized and interchangeable pools. We run a cultural template without question. And we wonder why we're not fulfilled. But no worries. To help us cope, we mow our standardized and interchangeable lawns with our standardized and interchangeable mowers and hope we don't get too many standardized and interchangeable weeds. So then we work even harder to get more of what isn't working in the first place. And that kind of sums up manhood in a standardized, interchangeable form in 2021. Perfect. What's not to love about that? Is there anything about that template that has you feeling like one of David's mighty men? Or do you just feel like an exhausted hunk of not much? That's what I really see in men these days. They feel like exhausted hunks of not much. And what they really hope is to get a day off. Maybe a day they could do what they wanted to. Can you feel the frustration of the author of Ecclesiastes when he writes everything is meaningless? Generations come and go, but nothing really changes. Everything is so weary and tiresome. Anybody else notice as you get older, you tend to get grouchy? I remember when I was 30, and I always think about, man, those old dudes are grouchy. When I'm an old dude, I'm not going to be grouchy. Yeah, right. The author of Ecclesiastes says, no matter how much we see, we're never satisfied. Men today have become like hamsters in a cage, convinced the key to happiness will be found in finding a better cage. And if that was the end of my message right now, if this was the end, we'd just hand out antidepressants and whiskey and we could all go home. But there's more. There's an opportunity we have. And let me tell you why we have the opportunity. Because we ain't dead yet. You know, death is a final chapter. And when we die, what we are is done in this world. For better, for worse. But we aren't dead yet. We might be tired, but we're not dead. We still have an opportunity to determine our legacy, to determine how we're remembered and what we stand for. What if we decided to break the gravitational pull of the standardized and interchangeable? What if we decided to push the limits, question the template, think exponentially? What if we decided as old dudes who don't run fast anymore to shift it into warp speed? What if we decided to get out of the cage, pursue the pings, pursue our dreams, and actually entertain the possibility that God created us to live free and victorious lives like David's mighty men? And what if we stop telling ourselves it's too late and the best days were long ago and we'll never get that again? What if we decided to live now? And what if we decided to leverage everything we have learned and everything we have been through into the best years we possibly can with what remains of our lives? Would that not reboot us? What if we decided to passionately pursue the life God created for us? What if we served God and fought Satan as a band of brothers? What if we committed our lives to something greater than ourselves and changed the trajectories even now of our marriages, friendships, careers, and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren forever? What if we decided to become spiritual leaders? What if we decided to get our heads up again and get the wind back in our sails and boldly lead our families by our virtues of fidelity and integrity and strength and passion and gentleness and courage? What if the men of no greater love truly decided to become great and stood above the rest? And what if our end game was to be remembered as warriors of God? What if our end game was to be remembered for us at our best and not forever be defined by the stupidest thing we've ever done? What if people at our funerals would look at us and say, he was a good man, and then someone corrects them and says, no, he was a great man. He was a warrior of the Almighty God, and he taught me how to be a warrior too. We can be men like that. There's still time. We ain't dead yet. So let's meet three such men. Joshua, being the commander, killed 800 men in one battle with a spear. I like it. 800 men, one battle with a spear. He is the man in charge. He is a one-man wrecking crew. He's better than everybody else. He is the greatest of all time. But I love something about Joshua. He doesn't settle for just being the greatest warrior. He is a guy who led an entire army. He decided it wasn't enough just to be great himself. He decided to make everybody around him greater. What an incredible gift. Next was Eleazar, who fought back to back with David against the Philistines when all the others had fled. Eleazar had a quality I've always admired in a man. He was half nuts. And David had something Eleazar admired in a man. He was half nuts too. Eleazar was a man of irrational courage who was simply not going to abandon his king, even when there was no real chance of coming out alive. He just wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't backing off. And as long as David was going to stand in there, he was going to stand in there with him. When everyone else retreated, Eleazar and David would not quit the field. You want to know why? Because they came prepared to die, but they didn't come to lose. They fought against overwhelming odds until their courage turned the tide. And finally, the other soldiers regrouped and rallied behind them until the battle was won. You know what we need right now in this post-COVID, generally weak sauce marinated world? We need a few Davids and Eleazars who are going to stand out there and fight until the troops rally again. They're looking for inspiration, and at some point, we're going to have to decide what David and Eleazar decided. We're just going to have to decide. We are prepared to die, but we're going to have to decide that we're not prepared to lose. And we are going to stand in, and we're going to hold our ground, and we're going to stand up, and we're going to do what God asks us to do, and we're going to be what God asks us to be. Two men, half nuts, turned the tide. The scripture says everyone returned to collect the plunder. Oh, they always do. But no one ever forgot who won that battle. You know, as a pastor who's been in one place for 25 years, we've had our challenges. We've had our ups and we've had our downs. But I've got to tell you that as a pastor, I'm appreciative of everybody at Christ Church. But I'll never forget the folks that loved me and supported me and fought back to back with me when the odds were against us. I'll never forget those people. Everybody loves you when you're on top. When you're fighting for your life, that's when you find out who your brothers are. That's when you find out who your friends are. That's when you find out what you got in life. And you know, those people that stood by me in the difficult times will get a benefit of 1,000 doubts with me. And they will always have my utmost gratitude and my respect. You see, this is a time for faithfulness, men. This is a time to stand up and stand by those who have the courage to get out there in a world where the odds are overwhelming and swing a sword. This is time to stand by those people. I don't want to be one of the guys that returns to collect the plunder. I want to be one of those guys that doesn't quit the field. I bet every time David looked at Eleazar, he remembered that day that they refused to lose. That day they should not have come out alive, but they did. How many times do you think they told that story? How many times do you think they told that story? I'll bet you every new recruit to David's army had to hear that story. And I bet you every member of David's army heard that story 100 times. Who's going to remember you? What stories will they tell about you? What is our defining moment? What will be our defining moment? Where will we make our stand? These are the kind of questions that mighty men ask. Because if you're going to shift from success, which is easy to do because we really don't have a chance to be successful anymore. I mean, seriously, we really don't. If you shift from success to significance, it brings in a whole new set of questions. But what it really brings in is the concept of legacy. Success is what you did. Legacy is what you leave behind. As I get older, I'm more concerned about what I'm leaving behind. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm less impressed by the day with what I've done. I'm just less impressed with it every day. And I'd hate to live my life thinking the best days of my life are behind me. And the best accomplishments I'll ever have already been accomplished. I mean, if that was the case, what's the point of living if God doesn't have some battles yet to be won? If God doesn't still need some soldiers, why would he have left us? You say, well, I'm not what I once was. None of us are what we once were. I don't have the vertical leap of a Marissa, Illinois phone book at this point in my life. But you know what? I'm a heck of a lot smarter than I used to be. I'm a lot more focused than I used to be. You may not be what you once were, but you are right now a man God can use in his army for his glory. And Eleazar teaches us something. Sometimes all God needs is somebody that's going to be faithful and not back down. Somebody's just going to stand in there when no one has guts to do it. Who's just going to stand the ground and hold the spot. Those of you that have been going to Mardi Gras the past year or two, I know there's not been many. But you've stood the ground, you've held the spot. And when the troops regroup and return, and they will have no idea of what has been done when they go back down and there's still an anointing on a spot because you held it. Don't think like the world thinks. Let God use you. in truly significant ways. Verse 11, next was Shammah, who held his ground against an attack of the Philistines when the whole army fled. I like this. He is an army of one. He's just out there swinging. He held off everybody by himself. He doesn't back down in the face of overwhelming odds. He stands alone, and in doing so, he becomes a legend. This is a man for whom there was no retreat. No one else was there. He still would not back down. He should have died that day, but he didn't. His enemies died. And men like this are the kind of men no one ever forgets. So let's take a look at mighty men. What does mighty men have? What do we need right now to reboot? What do we need right now to get our wind back? What do we need right now to swallow our losses and our pain and move forward into what God still has for us until that great reunion we will have someday in heaven? What do we need right now? I got 5 things for you. Number 1, we need a great cause. We need a great cause. If your cause is no bigger than yourself, it's never going to be a great cause. I love organizations, churches, ministries that give people a great cause. You want a great cause? Put the gospel into the hands of faithful men. That is a cause that will produce a legacy. And a lot of us have seen generations of that legacy. So you need a great cause. What is your cause? If I ask you to write that down right now, what is your cause? Mighty men can write that down. Number 2, a great commitment. Just a great commitment. There's nothing easier than being terrible. I learned that coaching. There's nothing easier than being a terrible team. You don't have to practice. You don't have to work out. Don't have to do anything. You just have fun all the time. You go get your butts kicked in games, and if that doesn't bother you too bad, but man, if you want to be great, you have to be committed to something. And it can't just be committed to giving your efforts during game time. You got to stay in shape with prayer and study and fellowship and witness and worship and all those things. That's what keeps us in shape. And then when the battles come, we've got wind and we got energy and we got strength in our arms and in our legs. It's going to take commitment, not just during games. Number 3, it's going to take a great sacrifice. Being great will cost you something. It may cost you everything. It's going to take a great sacrifice. I don't think any of us are truly free to live until we've dealt with death. And the bottom line is, unless Jesus returns, we're all going to die of something. Right? We're all going to die of something. Do you know every person Jesus healed died? Lazarus dead. Twice. I mean, think about it. We come with a shelf life, and it's not that of a Hostess Twinkie. It's shorter. We come with a shelf life. We need to be prepared to offer great sacrifice to a life of greatness. Number 4, we need a great victory. And that's part of what is really important about times like this, when soldiers can get together and plan for the future, plan for future victories. You know, when I think about the great victories in my life, I remember some of those early Mardi Gras when all hell was just breaking loose, and you're sitting there and you remember just trying to push through. Just trying to push through when you had 300 guys spread out over 2 blocks. And back in my early days, I ran point most of the time. That means I was a guy out in front of the cross asking people to please move, knowing that if they separated, they would not be able to be reunited with the people they came with for up to 6 hours. I mean, it was really a bad thing that we're asking of these people. I remember one time I'm down in New Orleans and we got 300 guys behind us, 2 or 3 abreast, and we just got this big red snake behind us, just kind of winding back there. And I'm up at the front And I remember I said to somebody, excuse me, would you mind letting us through? And somebody looked and they saw our whole group and they said, don't let them through, don't let them through. And they all just sort of, I said, here's the deal, dude. If you don't let us through, we're just going to stand here and sing, and these guys can sing a long time. He goes, let them through, let them through. Some of my greatest memories and victories, it's just feeling like we went into the very bowels of hell, and we refused to even let the devil have Fat Tuesday on Bourbon Street. He didn't even get that. And that just felt like spiritual warfare. And it just felt like we were on the winning side. Satan, you may think you run this world. We're not even giving you Fat Tuesday on Bourbon Street. You don't even get that. Great victory. And then number 5 is a great legacy. What are we going to leave behind? Seems like my dad spends his whole life going to funerals these days. It's not just attending funerals. It's not just sending our best when we can't attend. It's celebrating men who died as mighty warriors. It's celebrating men who were a part of something bigger than themselves. It's celebrating the lives of men who lived with a great cause, a great commitment, a great sacrifice, a great victory, and are leaving a great legacy. So where does it all begin? I think it begins here and here. We're going to have to convince ourselves once again that we are mighty warriors. We're going to have to convince ourselves that our lives are not over. We're going to have to convince ourselves that the Holy Spirit's still in business. It begins here with us. Number 2, it extends to our families. It extends to our families. Number 3, it extends to our churches. I remember in my early days of ministry, I was a pastor at a little church called Sumner. Sumner ran a couple hundred, and I remember taking about 10, 15, 20 guys to Mardi Gras. Those guys caught on fire for Jesus. They came back. They changed. Their lives were changed. The lives of their families were changed, and the trajectory of that church was forever changed. You get a few people on fire, it's amazing what God can do. It's got to extend to our vocations, number 4. Some of you may think, man, I think you get this age sometimes and you get thinking about, start counting the days till you retire. I've noticed something, guys. The guys that retire from something don't do very well. The guys who retire to something do real well. So I think a great question would be, what are you going to retire to? What is it God's asking you to do that takes more time than you had during your working years? That's a good question. What's God asking you to do that requires more time than you had to give during your working years? I would answer that question before I retire. I'd retire to something. Number 5, where does it all begin? It begins with a ministry, with a sense that you are a part of something bigger than yourself, a part that you fit somewhere, and that your gifts are needed somewhere. And then just that legacy piece, which I think is so incredibly important. I know that what many of you invested in me 40 years ago is still there. And there are so many of you that I could say in one sentence how your life somehow pressed a thumbprint into my life and how grateful I am. But there's also this exponential piece to legacy. Dad often speaks of a man named Junior Axley who led him to Christ. If you look at Junior Axley's life, he loved God, but it was a pretty micro life. But in that life, he did one thing among probably 1,000 other things, he led Fred Bishop to Christ. And all of a sudden, things went exponential on him. It's kind of like you invest in a lot of stocks, but one goes crazy in your favor. And every single person that Fred Bishop has touched, and every single ministry that No Greater Love has spawned, in some way goes back to Junior Axley and what God did through him. You may have led people to Christ that you don't even remember, that God has done exponential things through their lives and ministries. Guys, we are a part of this incredible legacy. And a lot of times we only count our goals, but you'd be surprised how many assists I think we get in the kingdom of heaven. Because a lot of times, it says, one person plants, another person waters, another person harvests. Sometimes just by living the ping life, you just may be on the planting side. Somebody else may harvest, but you still get an assist. You may be on the watering side. Somebody else may harvest, but you still get an assist. You may not even know you got the assist. You may have a legacy that is built up through faithfulness to God that you have no idea how significant it truly is. I think if Sam were sitting here right now and he heard what people said about him, do you think he would have ever thought that he made that much of an impact in the lives of so many people? Do you think if Dane were sitting here, he would have ever thought he made such a huge impact? Do you think if those guys had read all that's been written about him on Facebook and social media, do you think they understood that? Guys, when we live as soldiers for God, our lives go exponential like that. Sometimes you get discouraged, you don't feel like you're doing much. You need to understand, all God needs is faithful men. And the legacy builds itself. I want to suggest that this is a good time to reject the standardized interchangeable template. And I think one of the worst ones is just the retirement template. You may think playing golf 12 days a week is going to make you happy. It won't. Playing a lot of golf doesn't make you better. It just ingrains how bad you are. It's not going to cure it. Retirement isn't going to cure this thing you have. And we've got to reject this standardized and interchangeable template. We have to embrace the fact we are alive and the Holy Spirit is still active. And God wouldn't have you alive if he didn't want something from you still. And we have to understand that everything God has done in your life to this point has put you in a place that God can do more with you than he ever could have before. This is our time. This is our for such a time as this moment. We just got to embrace it. You say, yeah, but it's hard. Why do you need it for such a time as this moment when things are easy? You only need it when it's hard. You only need leadership when it's hard. It's a good time to win. It's a good time to be a free man of God. God is asking something extraordinary of us, even now. And we're going to stand out even more than we have in the past to offer it because it's hard. God is asking something of us that will involve sacrifice and risk and courage and commitment. And may I say heroism. We have the opportunity to become mighty men of God. And maybe to our surprise, one day when we die, we will be counted among the 30. Or maybe even the 3. Let this day be a new beginning. We can't go back. It isn't there. We have today. And if God is gracious tomorrow, let's begin the life, the legend, and the legacy of the mighty men of No Greater Love Ministries all over again. I got a closing story, and then I'm done. When I arrived at Christ Church 25 years ago, I had an associate pastor by the name of Ralph Phillippe. Ralph was about 72, little guy, wiry, loved him. He soon became just a best friend, twice my age. We had lunch about 200 days a year. Jim, Mike, you guys knew Ralph well. When we made our first all-church trip to Honduras, Ralph told me that he was going to go. And I said, Ralph, that's a terrible idea. He said, why is it a terrible idea? I said, because it's a work trip. It's hotter than 6 kinds of smoke down there, and you don't have a lick of sense. And you're going to get down there and something terrible is going to happen. And I'm going to feel like it's my fault. You don't need to go. He just got mad. I said, do you even speak any Spanish? He said, adios and gracias. I said, Ralph, this isn't looking good. He looked at me and he said, I didn't need a mother before I met you, and I don't need one now. God's telling me to go, and I'm going. I said, in that case, do you need a roommate? He said, yes. So we went down. The trip split. One group went to Taylor. I went down there. They did a little medical clinic. I was going to preach at a church. And the other group stayed in San Pedro Sula for a work trip at a church. I said, Ralph, come to Taylor with me. I said, nothing bad will happen there. And he said, no. He goes, I was a construction worker before I accepted Christ. And he said, if I go to Taylor, I'll be just as useless as you'll be, but I could stay here and actually be helpful. It's kind of hard to argue with. And we split ways. I got done preaching at Taylor, and a courier stopped us in a car and informed us that Ralph had fallen off of the roof that he was working on in San Pedro Sula, and had hit his head on a big hunk of concrete that had dried, and he was in a coma. Jumped on a bus, no air conditioning. In my mind, there were chickens. Drove all the way back to San Pedro Sula. I walked into the hospital room, and Ralph was in a deep, deep coma. I'll make a really long story short. He died. He died. And our whole church felt like somebody had just driven a fist through our gut. For years after that, I would go to preachers' meetings. And all these old dudes would always ask me, Shane, is Ralph Phillippe still alive? For years, probably a decade. And I would always say, no, sir, he is not. And they always said, how did he die? And I said, he died really, really well. He died the way he lived, with his boots on, swinging a hammer, loving people, didn't look a thing like him, that he couldn't speak to in any way. He died really, really well. The invitation of no greater love has always been come and die with me. Fred Bishop has always offered the invitation. Come and die with me. Come and live more life than you ever imagined. And if we die, we will die as warriors and free men. And at least we won't rust out or die in a cage. No greater love taught me something that has guided my entire life and my entire ministry that I've passed to my children and my grandchildren. And it is simply this: you will never have a life worth living for until you have a life worth dying for. Mighty men of God go to the battlefield prepared to die, but they're not prepared to lose.